Okay, let's get started, everyone. Well, thanks again for being so prompt. We got that chat button. Use it. Let us know where you're chatting in from and what's going on in your area. I have with me today Carly Levin. She's part of the team here at Datassential. She's going to share some insight on what's happening with trends, and we have a lot of stuff to cover today. So just fair warning, there is a small percentage chance that we may go a minute or two over. We're going to do our best to make sure that does not happen, but you never quite know. So let's see. As a reminder, when you're chatting, make sure you select both all panelists and attendees if you want to be able to sort of share things with the rest of the food community that we have in this session. You know, typically there's usually over 1,000 people, and sometimes significantly more than that join these sessions. It really is a fantastic way to just keep us all together and connected. We're all food professionals from various parts of the industry. A lot of people that are with manufacturers on both the food service and some on the retail side, restaurant operators and chains, retailers as well, distributors, the entire ecosystem. So it's a great way to just reconnect with your colleagues and essentially this broader food family that we all have. So use that and please say hi. As a reminder, our very next webinar is September 3rd. So these are every other Thursday, as you now know, so every 2 weeks at noon Central. We got something pretty awesome in store for you in 2 weeks, so we will see you then. Make sure you click back in. And I just wanted to really quickly start off with a couple of those, big picture things that we talk about in each one of these sessions, and it's really the three big stats, right? As it relates to COVID. Are you very concerned about COVID or not? And as you can see, after a long period of decline, all of a sudden as cases started to spike, the level of concern started to spike, and we saw yet another small further spike in the first couple of weeks of August. I think a lot of this is probably due to the return to school and the additional anxiety that has created for parents and families. So this is the percentage of people, 62% in our most recent data just a couple days ago, say they are very concerned with coronavirus. The question though is, does this manifest into some level of real concern or apprehension about going out to get something to eat? And there, the story is actually a little bit different, that where we did see a spike from, let's say, June to July as cases started to rise, that number has subsided a little bit, and we do not see the same spike in August, in early August, for, hey, I don't want to eat out, that we saw for, I'm just generally very concerned about COVID. So we're seeing a little bit of a divergence between those two things, and I really think that maybe that might be more of a temporary divergence, of that spike that we saw for me being, for people being very personally concerned about COVID, may have had a little bit more to do with the start of school. So it's not entirely clear, but we'll learn more as the data continues in our future sessions. As it stands today, that split between whether people are viewing this moment as more of an economic crisis or as a public health crisis, it's getting there, again, closer to 50-50. This number has not really moved from 2 weeks ago, but it's 56 public health, 44 economic. If you remember back to the early days of the pandemic, it was something like 63 public health, 37 economic. We then actually got to a point where we're getting a little bit close to 50-50. I think it was like 52-48. Since the cases started to spike again, we did get back to something that's a little bit more public health than economic, but we're not seeing very, very drastic changes there. So with that in mind, I did want to maybe just share some thoughts from some recent research we've done about how people are viewing their financial situations going forward. So if you think about the things that are going to really have an impact on behavior, it's not strictly what's happening with the pandemic and the near-term ripples that are extending from it, but just how are we feeling about our financial situations as consumers, and what's that going to mean more long-term potentially? Well, here's the first thing to keep in mind. So what's your financial situation versus pre-pandemic times? You can see that about a little less than half had said, you know what, money has actually become tighter for me. I tangibly feel like I have less available to spend than I used to. Another 35% said, even though I still have the same amount of money as I did versus, let's say, January, February, I'm actively trying to spend less as more of a precautionary measure. So in total, you get like almost a little over 80% of people that either have less money or have the same money but are more budget conscious. So watching that wallet or that checkbook or just what's in your pocket has become um, more important for consumers overall, and that tends to be true for a majority of consumers at this point. Some of it is real and some of it is precautionary. Where people have cut back on spending over recent periods, it's interesting. You can see that on the right-hand side, you don't have a ton of people saying they've cut back on groceries, but on the left-hand side, restaurant food is one of the areas where we've seen the most severe cutbacks across all the different sectors of the economy. The only thing that rivals food from restaurants is stuff like clothing, where quite literally people are not even able to go into a store to try on or buy clothes. So you definitely see a divergence there between the food service side of the business and the retail side of the business. Whether this is going to be the continued behavior is not quite clear. It's sort of interesting when you ask people questions about what do you plan to do in the future, the answers you often get are basically more a reflection of what people have been doing up until that point. It's one of the reasons that you should always have some additional context if you're going to, let's say on a survey, ask, hey, what are your plans for 2021, or what do you plan on changing in the month ahead? There's always some momentum based on what people were doing up until that point, and you sort of need that context to understand that things actually will change. My suspicion is that you'll see that 45% number start to recede a little bit in the periods ahead. But if you were to ask people today, right now, what do you think you're going to be cutting back on in the future? They'll probably answer relative to the things they've already been doing. And they would say something like, oh yeah, I plan on not spending as much as at restaurants because that's already what I've been doing up till now. So just a little bit of an insight on how you would often read things like survey data to make sense of what actual behavior could be. So let's take a look at what's actually happening with spending at restaurants. So 1/3 of Americans say they're now more closely following a specific budget. So they're actually, they either didn't have a budget previously, like a set dollar amount, and now they've created one, or they had a set dollar amount before and they're adhering to it more closely. They're, actionably following a specific dollar target on what to spend when they get food from a restaurant, let's say. Another 43% say, yeah, I don't necessarily have a hard dollar amount in mind, but I sure am trying to watch prices closer. So they are being more cost conscious. So collectively, 3 out of 4 consumers is being more cost conscious in how they spend and engage with restaurants, leaving 1/4 that said, you know what, I am doing things just as I did before. I perceive things the way as I did before. There's really no change in my spending behavior, or I might even be spending more than I did previously. So there's about a 3-to-1 split. We wanted to understand what would happen if you were to get some more money in your pocket. And it's actually interesting that we have a little bit of historic context for this now. So if you remember back a few months, we had that first round of consumer stimulus that was distributed. And we asked ahead of people actually receiving the stimulus, what do you plan on doing with that money, with that stimulus check, if you should get one? And here's what they told us, right? About 62% said I'm going to save some or part of it or all of it. 41% said it's going to go towards a rent or mortgage. And you could see restaurants were about 19%. We asked this question again just now to see what people plan on doing with this next round of stimulus, if it should happen. And the question is are consumers planning on doing different things this time? Or are they just going to sort of do what they did the first time? And if you look at the numbers, right, they actually look pretty dramatically similar. Save it, still right around 60%. Pay rent, mortgage, still right around 40%. Groceries, still in that 35, 38% range. The next item, though, is the one area where things have actually changed dramatically. That you have more people today saying, you know what, I'm going to use some of that money if I should get it to pay down debts. 49% in this next round versus 36% in the first round. People have probably accrued more debt, over the past few months, and this has become a larger concern. So generally similar. Other than that, there's going to be less money available for all these other activities because some of it's probably going to be eaten up more comparatively toward things like paying down debt, as people is generally more debt today than they did prior to that first round of stimulus. But you might look at this and say, well, that means we have to go full bore on featuring like value menus and deals and price promotions because people are cost conscious. And again, this has been sort of a recurring theme of the story that we've been trying to tell, which is value is a wonderful way of stimulating activity, but it really is just part of the answer. And I want to go back to something that we sort of flashed a number of sessions ago that I think is just as important today, and perhaps even more so, which is there are sort of two ways of going about creating value. If, let's say, you're a restaurant or something, the first route is to go down that avenue of packaged deals where you're basically saying, okay, let's go with dollar menu or a discounted combo meal or a 2 for $20 or 5 items for $5 or something where it's all about the price, that it's not a new item on the menu or anything different. It's just some repackaging to promote around price. And that is sort of like a short-term fix, right? That's something you can do right away that can stimulate some activity. And we've seen some brands start to do quite a bit of this. But that short-term fix really should be thought of as just a short-term solution. The thing that happens and that becomes dangerous is when a brand might sort of conflate that short-term fix and start thinking of it as a long-term solution, which it's not. If we want to really focus on value in the long term, it's really got to be done through value-based innovation, an examination of what confers value to the consumer relative to that brand or menu or proposition, and building new ideas, new menu items, new products around that. So perhaps, if you're a restaurant, you may find that your customer really values, cheesy items, like that seems valuable to them. Then we should be innovating around that. And the only piece of caution, we really want to throw out there is make sure we do not confuse what is a short-term fix, all those price promos, with a real long-term strategy. Because if you go overboard on the price promos and forget all the innovation, it becomes unclear what the brand is actually all about at that point. Consumers may just start thinking of your brand as a discount food brand, which is not a good place to be in the long run. Beyond that, and you can tell that we're making a bit of a case for innovation here, we're starting to see that food boredom has settled in. It's begun to settle in. So think of how long we've all been at home, and many of us have been eating similar things day in and day out. If you haven't been engaging and going out to restaurants, there's a good chance you're on some sort of a rotation of, mac and cheese and grilled cheese sandwiches and items like that. And if you look at the stats, 65% of consumers as of today say they're now tired of cooking at home. 58% say they've now grown bored of comfort foods. Remember, we said very early on in this pandemic that the thing you're going to see spike is consumption of comfort foods. People are going to flock towards that because in a time of uncertainty, it gives you comfort. But we've had a lot of comfort food now, and we're starting to get sort of bored of it. And that 80%, almost 80% say, I'm now craving something new. I've had this endless cycle of comfort foods and things at home for a while. I need something new to spice things up in my life from a food perspective. So you ask a question, right? What would make a consumer choose to get something away from home versus just having something from home? And the number one thing is quite obvious, but we shouldn't lose sight of it, which is, look, I choose food service because I want things I just can't easily or readily have from home. And this is a real lesson. So it's very easy for, let's say, again, imagine that you're a restaurant and you're seeing what's selling on your menu right now. You've just, reopened over the last couple of months, and let's say business is good, and you're finding that a lot of people are coming in and ordering your classic, familiar, comfort-like items, like some of your best sellers from, from your brand's history. That is completely predictable, right? Because if you imagine a restaurant you haven't been to in a long time, when you go back, you probably already know what dish you want to order, and it's probably gonna be one of those popular favorites. But over time, people are gonna say, okay, I've had that a few times now. I need something new or different, or that I just can't get for my home already. So I would say one word of warning is realize that there's gonna be some bias built into what your, let's say, sales tickets look like early on as restaurants reopen. That if you're seeing that, hey, almost everyone is ordering like our favorite #1 burger, that might be because that's the one thing that people really craved during this time. But once they've had it a few times, they might start looking for other things too. And we need innovation to get there. So innovation, we think, really is how food service wins in all of this. And again, we cannot repeat it enough. If we don't sort of play to that one sort of core thing that consumers say, hey, I want something new right now because I'm getting bored with all these things I've been eating over and over again. And the thing that's going to drive me out of my home and into a restaurant or to order delivery or something else is the ability to try something new. It's got to be innovation that takes us there. So with that in mind, we wanted to talk about a couple of platforms where innovation becomes particularly important. There's virtually an infinite number of these platforms, but we wanted to focus on a couple that we thought were really worth spotlighting. And the first is something that you all know, that the industry has been talking about for quite some time now. So we wanted to do a little bit of a reminder as to how important this is and why there's tremendous growth opportunity for something like plant-based eating. So take a look at how people eat today, right? This is the percentage of consumers that say they're full, unabashed meat eaters. 69% say they are, and you can see the numbers for some of these other sort of, semi-meat or non-meat eating approaches. The question then is, well, how do you want to eat? What's your approach to eating tomorrow, let's say? And here that is in green. And you can see there is clearly a difference between whether people are having meat today and whether they want to be eating it full-time tomorrow. But if you look at some of the other areas, right, you do see a bump in veganism and vegetarianism. But the thing where you see the largest increase, and it's also the biggest of those other types of eating approaches, is flexitarian eating, right? So I don't want to be vegan all the time. I want to be able to moderate a little bit. And if you ask those that either self-identify as a flexitarian or say they want to be like a flexitarian, and you ask them, what does that mean to you? Does it mean that you want to have certain rules around how you eat? They actually say no. They say flexitarian eating is something that I sort of construct myself, and it's not necessarily a specific set of rules. It's not saying I can only eat so much meat, or I can only have it on certain days of the week, or only in certain meals. It just means the general desire to, let's say, reduce meat consumption in my diet and bring in more plant-based foods. And this really is the key sort of market that is going to grow. And I think we saw perhaps some question about, hey, is plant-based going to pause a little bit as a result of the pandemic, the fact that everyone's just eating comfort foods at home? But we saw very quickly consumers say, you know what, I'm ready for it again. And now I'm really hungry for it because I'm getting tired of some of the things that I've already been having. You can see the numbers quite clearly, right? 58% of consumers, they want to increase plant-based foods in a diet versus just 4% that say I have any desire to decrease it. And wanted to bring in Carly to talk about some of the ways to potentially do this, starting with some really sort of craveable plant-based options, then taking a look at maybe what the next generation of plant-based looks like. So Carly, what is this that we have here?
This is the collard green melt from Turkey and the Wolf in New Orleans. And, I've been a vegetarian for 16 years. And a lot of times there's a concern with, you know, vegetarian satisfying, as, you know, as foods containing meat. I was on a Zoom call with friends recently, and I said I was making buffalo cauliflower wings, and someone actually thought I was just taking pieces of raw cauliflower and putting buffalo sauce on them, which is not appealing or satisfying in the slightest. So this sandwich has slow cooked collards, it's got a pickled cherry vinaigrette, coleslaw, Swiss cheese, it's on rye, and it's incredibly satisfying. It's actually, I think, their most popular sandwich, despite having multiple meat options on the menu. And I've actually had the privilege of eating this, and you need two hands. It's very drippy, it's very satisfying. You know, it's a highly craveable sandwich. So something like this is going to be the next generation of vegetarian and plant-based food.
All right. And what we could do is, if you want me to go to the next slide, just tell me next slide.
Next slide, please. So we wanted to talk about, you know, since I did the plant-based webinar in March, we're even seeing more new things come to the surface because this trend is moving so fast. We wanted to talk about some new plant-based alternatives, an update on some old ones, and just show you what the landscape might look like in the future. Next slide, please, Jack. So this is Aqua Faba. Aqua Faba is the liquid that comes from chickpeas in the can or after you cook them, and it has all that beany, starchy, proteiny goodness. And because of that, you can use it as a substitute for eggs or mayo or meringue. It whips up just like a meringue. You can use it as an egg white foam on top of cocktails, and it's really been growing on menus for the past 4 years. It's also pretty sustainable because this is basically a byproduct of cooking chickpeas. So this is something that has had incredibly low menu penetration, has been growing, and we're starting to see it grow even more as people start to dive deeper into plant-based eating. Next slide, please. Another offering we wanted to talk about is halloumi. So halloumi is a cheese, it is an animal product. It's heavily used in Mediterranean cuisines. And it's growing in part because it's a great stand-in for animal protein. It has a very, very high melting point, so you can grill it, you can fry it, you can saute it, kind of like here where you see it almost looks like a chicken breast, and it's gonna retain its shape and texture like meat would when you cook it like that. Next slide, please, Jack. And one of the reasons, you know, halloumi is growing so much because it's a meat replacer. And if we take a look at our global databases and menu trends, we can actually see it's much more common in other countries, like in the United Kingdom and Hong Kong. And especially in the United Kingdom, they're a little bit ahead of us in terms of their vegan, vegetarian, and plant-based offerings. So we can look to items like halloumi that are more prevalent in other cuisines as plant-based proteins to get an idea of what might continue to trend here. Next slide, please, Jack. So these are some examples from the UK of halloumi being used as a meat replacer. Here we can see that it's in a wrap, grilled with salad and chili sauce, or in a Buddha bowl. And here they actually note that your protein can be halloumi or grilled chicken, likely both prepared the same way. There's also a halloumi burger with fried halloumi instead of a meat patty. And then this veggie breakfast plate is a traditional English breakfast with grilled halloumi standing in for the animal protein. And same with this club sandwich here. And if we go to the next slide, this is actually a halloumi burger from Burger King. It's released last year in the UK. So, and you see those fried halloumi patties standing in for the meat. So this is something that will likely continue to trend in the US, taking some cues from overseas. Next slide, please. We're also seeing soy-free begin to grow on menus, and this is an interesting one. You know, and it is growing mostly in plant-based dishes and substitutes because for years, a lot of plant-based replacer products like, you know, vegan meat relied heavily on soy. Even tofu, which is one of the more common plant-based proteins, is a soy product. And there have been some growing concerns about soy. Allergies are on the rise. There's some health concerns about eating too much soy. So now we're actually starting to see restaurants call out that their dishes, especially plant-based dishes, don't contain soy. And if we go to the next slide, one of the early ingredients we want to highlight here is this tofu. This is Burmese or Shan tofu. And it's made with chickpea flour. So the process is very similar to polenta. You cook it with boiling water and you let it set. And then once it sets, you can cut it and use it like you would soy tofu. You can fry it, saute it, etc. So this could be an alternative to offer a more familiar plant-based protein without the allergy concerns.
So Carly, help me understand this. So tofu is traditionally made from soy. Is this also considered tofu? Is this like a fake tofu essentially, or how do you think? Tofu analog? What is this?
It is a tofu analog, I would say. It's actually pretty common in Burmese cuisine. That's where it comes from. I'm seeing a question about if it's fermented. It's not fermented. It's made with chickpea flour and boiling water, so it's almost more similar to a polenta, but it is treated like and called tofu.
Yeah, it's almost very meta, right? Because tofu is a meat replacer, and this is a tofu replacer in a way. So it's a double replacer of some sort.
Exactly.
Oh, interesting.
And then we also wanted to talk about vegan cheese. This is something we've been seeing growing steadily. It's actually the top trending cheese, even compared to other dairy cheeses on menus. And there might be some opportunity here, as cheese is often cited by vegetarians, vegans, and just meat eaters, flexitarians, as one of the toughest products to give up, even harder than meat. I think they've done some studies, and cheese lights up the same reward centers in our brains as hard drugs. You can actually become addicted to cheese. So, we have a lot like Beyond, Impossible, Sweet Earth. There are a lot of meat replacers out there that nearly exactly mimic meat, but there's nothing quite like that for cheese on the menu. So we're wondering if that will become an area of focus within the next couple of years too. And then we also wanted to talk about jackfruit. So jackfruit has been continuing to grow on menus. It's traditional in South Asian cuisine, where they eat the ripe version as a fruit. So it's, common in beverages and desserts. But in the US, if we switch to the next slide, we can start, we've been using it in the US in the unripe version because the texture is really, really similar to pulled meat. So this is a pulled pork sandwich without pork. The pulled pork here is made from jackfruit cooked with barbecue sauce. And then on the next slide, we can see this is jackfruit in tacos too. So the texture here is super important because it mimics that shredded meat. On the next slide, we want to highlight another ingredient where texture is key. This is heart of palm. So, heart of palm, at least in the US, has been a staple on salad bars. It's kind of not an exciting vegetable, but it's having a resurgence as a seafood substitute. And that's because it has that really nice flaky texture, kind of like seafood, and a more mild flavor. So if we flip to the next slide, we can see some examples of heart of palm. This is it sauteed on tacos as a seafood meat replacer, and you can also actually cut it similar to this and saute it in butter like you would a scallop too. On the next slide, we can see this is heart of palm calamari. So it's been cut, hollowed out, and deep fried just like calamari is a plant-based substitute.
Where are you seeing this in restaurants? Are these like vegan restaurants, or are these sort of mainstream restaurants where you'd find this?
These are more independent, trend-forward operators, but with plant-focused menus, but not completely vegan menus. This is Crossroads Kitchen in Los Angeles, and I don't believe it's completely vegan, but they do have more of a plant-forward focus.
Yeah, it's really cool.
And then the next slide is, this is a personal favorite. This is vegan ceviche, and this is actually at the Four Seasons in Maui, so I'm not completely vegetarian. And you can cut up and marinate the hearts of palm like you would the fish in ceviche. And this one is actually something personally I make for dinner all the time because you can have an entire bag of chips for dinner plus some vegetables. So it's super easy to make at home and delicious. On the next slide, we're seeing a really interesting new plant-based substitute start to emerge. This is a banana blossom. So this is really common in Southeast Asian and Indian cuisine. And they saute it, they stir fry it, and it's got a very mild texture and taste similar to an artichoke. And if we go to the next slide, this is what it looks like cut open. So it's got a flaky texture. Texture-wise and looks-wise, it's actually pretty similar to jackfruit. And you can purchase it canned or raw.
You said this is called a banana blossom?
Yeah, if you want to flip back one slide, you can kind of see the bananas on the tree growing above it. So you just pick the blossom before the bananas are ripe.
Oh, that's cool.
Mm-hmm. So next slide after this, there's actually a fish and chip shop in London called Sutton and Son. So this is not vegan. They have actual fish and chips. But if we flip to the next slide, they recently introduced a vegan fish and chips where the fish is made from banana blossoms.
That actually looks pretty realistic, doesn't it?
Right? Yeah. And when we were talking about the jackfruit earlier, talking about the heart of palm and talking about the banana blossom now, it is texture is just so important. Something can look like meat, it can taste like meat, but you want it to also feel like meat too, to get that satisfaction. So here we can see with the fish, as it were, cut open, it really does look like fish meat.
Yeah. So thanks for that, Carly. I'm going to bring you back in just a second. We did get a couple of questions about whether this and previous webinars will be available. So just a quick heads up, we do post these typically on the following Monday. There's a Datassential YouTube channel where you could get all the previous webinars, and each of the listings that you find there will have a link to the slides as well. So if you want to share this out with your colleagues, usually we have it up by the Monday that follows. Sometimes we're a little bit faster than that, but by Monday at the latest. So I wanted to do something that feels to me a little bit like a public service announcement, but I guess it's almost sort of more like a commercial, but I think it's so cool that it feels like a PSA to me. Most, if not the vast majority of you, use our Snap platform to tease out insights. And we have something that we just unveiled publicly this week that you should all go get right now. It's called Pocket Snap, and it takes all the things that you could do in Snap and puts them on your phone, and it's really quite awesome. I'm going to show it to you in just a moment, but what I'm going to ask right now is if your company subscribes to Snap, there's a very good chance that it does. Even if you have not created your own account yet, you could still download Pocket Snap and create an account in just a couple of seconds and get going. So it's available natively for iOS as well as for Android. So whether you're an Apple or you're a Google person, it's there for you. Go to the App Store right now. I'm asking you to do it as I'm going to present something. Just download it now and install it, and your life will be made a couple percentage points better immediately. It's really quite awesome. So I'm going to spend about 5 minutes and show you a couple of neat things in here. Then we'll get back to some other content. But as I'm presenting, literally just go to the App Store, search Pocket Snap, download this right now, and let's see if I can get this to work. So I'm actually going to try to share my screen from my phone. I have no idea if this is going to work. Yeah, look at that. Carly, can you see my screen, my phone?
I can.
So here's my phone. Oh, that was embarrassing. You just saw my Spirit Airlines app. So haven't used that one in a while, but let's open up Snap over here. And it looks like there's a little bit of a lag, but it works reasonably well. So again, you can download this right now. If you have a Snap subscription already, and most of you already do, if not you personally, your company, it costs nothing extra to use this. So you can think of it as the greatest free thing that you'll see all week. So the way it's broken out is there's a few different tabs. You can organize this by news. You sort of flip through news. It's always up to date of the latest things going on in the food industry. So whether you are monitoring certain chains, or you're a restaurant chain and you have a competitive set you wanted to keep tabs on, or let's say you're a salesperson and you want to see what's happening with your customers, you can go right there, tap on any of them, and of course that's just going to bring up the story for you. And it goes, back many different days and weeks, and it's up to date. You also have a tab called Food along the bottom over here. What Food shows you are all the different new items and limited time offers that have been released at restaurant chains and delis and C-stores and other places. And if your company happens to subscribe to our Scores service, you'll see that numbers also appear here as well. So I'm gonna pick this beef picadillo Tropicchop bowl at Pollo Tropical. I'm gonna give that a little tap over here, and it'll bring up not just the item, but it'll tell me what consumers think of it too. Is it something they'd say they'd want to order? Do they consider it to be unique? Would they have it all the time? Would they make a special trip for it? You get breakouts demographically for it as well. And you get sort of an overview too, where we're sort of scripting the things you should know about this item. And you see some examples of other items that might be similar or in the same category as well. So that's the Food tab. The Chains tab is really great. There's over 10,000 chains in the country, and you can see them all right here. So there's actually so many that it's going to take forever to scroll through this. So I'm going to use my filter option instead. If I can click it. And let's say I want to maybe not look at the entire US, but maybe I just want to look at a certain part of the country. So maybe I just want to look at, I don't know, let's pick Atlanta maybe. I'm going to hit apply. And here's my chains that are based out of Atlanta or that have a majority of their stores in Atlanta. I'll pick a big one we'll start with. Let's take a look at something like Arby's. Oh, so there is a question. This is called Pocket Snap, and you can download it from the App Store. And again, your company will need to have a Snap subscription from Datassential, but I think most of you that are on this webinar probably have that already. So if you're not sure, just give it a try and give us a call if you have trouble getting in, but most of you should be good to go already. So here's Arby's, and you can see some extended stats too. If you have our subscription to our Firefly Chains product, you can see some information on what growth has been like, what we're projecting for the future. You could see some recent news about Arby's. You could look at the contacts that are there. You could say, well, hey, I want to talk to this chief development officer, and hit their LinkedIn button. It'll actually open them up in LinkedIn for you as well. Let's go back. And you could also look at limited time offers that they've had recently, as well as their menu. You can open up their menu one piece at a time. And you can even see what they're doing in social media as well. And this exists for every chain in the country. And you see, as I keep scrolling in Atlanta, and I keep scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, the chains get smaller and smaller and smaller. We're not just talking about the top 100, 500, 1,000. We're talking every chain in the country, including a whole lot of chains I've never heard of before. Like, I'm not familiar with Grindhouse Killer Burgers, but I sure want to try it now. So it's all here for you. And you even have a documents tab where you can see all the amazing content that Datassential creates on trends. You could pull up any of these. Let's maybe just grab one over here. So let's look at, let's see what's happening in this issue of Trend Watch, the latest trends that are brewing. And we could hit view. You can actually view this in app, or you can just email this to yourself as a PDF, so it's waiting for you in your inbox. I hit the view button, so it's gonna pull this up, and I can just actually look at this in app and read it. Or if you wanna just send it to yourself, you can do that as well, and it'll be waiting for you in your inbox. So tons of trend content. And now to some of the really cool stuff. Actually, let's open this up. So here's that article. All right, so let's do something else really cool. We have this big search button here where you could search something like sriracha, if I could spell it right. It gives some options. I could look at documents and trends about sriracha, or I could just pick sriracha as an individual flavor or something, and it will search Snap and give us the data that we want. Is it growing? Is it shrinking? What do we know about it? So sriracha has still grown a little bit, up about 35% over the last 4 years, on 13% of menus now. That's overall, but I could say, well, what if I want to look at this among just QSRs? Looks like it's still growing at QSR. How about fine dining? Oh, that's interesting. Sriracha is actually shrinking in fine dining compared to the other segments. So you could do this, again, for anything that you need, and you can see examples of sriracha items. They're all here for you. I did want to show you one last really sort of cool thing that you can do in Pocket Snap. is you can go and, whoops, let me move this little zoom thing out of the way. You can tap this little thing in the upper right-hand corner, that little arrow thing that's shooting to the upper right, and that'll activate your GPS. I am not in the Indian Ocean. I am actually right here instead in Brentwood, Tennessee. And it'll find food establishments near you. I'm looking at a 4-mile basis, but I can maybe say, let's look at 5 miles instead. We'll draw a little bit bigger of a radius. I have a few more places to look at. And you can see all the different food options that are near me right now. You can tap one, you could call the place, you can get directions. So if you're, let's say, a salesperson on the road, you want to sort of interface with potential accounts, this is a great way of finding them. Or you could hit the stats button, and it shows you some stats on your local area. How many restaurants are there? Are they chains? Are they independents? What are the types of menus that you have right around you? How many people live within that vicinity near you? What ethnicities are they? You know, how many of them are millennials versus boomers? All of that is right there, and you can do it either for your current area, or you can just type in a city, state, something else, and it's right there for you too. So there's a lot more in here. I probably spent too much time on this. It's called Pocket Snap. You need a Snap subscription to access it, but again, the majority of food companies now use Snap, and this is just sort of a really nice, no-cost additional way of getting access to the data you're already getting from Datassential. So if you haven't already, go to the App Store right now, search Pocket Snap, download it right away, and I think you're gonna love it. So with that, I'm gonna try to stop sharing my screen in Zoom from my phone, and I'm gonna reshare our presentation. So, okay. So I want to talk about some insights that we've teased out of our flavor data. So flavor is a data set that basically looks at anything you could eat or drink, you know, and ask consumers, do you know what this is? Have you tried it before? Have you had it many times? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you fall somewhere in between? And we've learned a lot of interesting things from this. And one of the questions is, how did tastes and preferences sort of change or evolve across consumer generations? And I wanted to use an example over here. Let's look at butter cookies as an example. And let's say we want to understand how the interest in butter cookies varies between, let's say, boomers and the rest of the generation. So you can see from the flavor data that overall, 23% of people love butter cookies, 35% like it, so collectively 58% love or like butter cookies. So 58% of the general population loves butter cookies or likes butter cookies. Among boomers, that number jumps to 68%. So you have a 10% gap, a 10% skew toward boomers. Using this very basic type of analysis, we really want to understand, well, do you see significant skews across different types of food items toward different consumer groups? And we're going to look at generations today. So here you go. These are the top boomer skewing foods. We're going to look at boomers right now. And the numbers that you see is how much those items skew toward boomers in terms of whether people love or like them. So this is telling us, for instance, that a beefsteak tomato, you have a 21% higher score among boomers in terms of affinity for beefsteak tomatoes than you do among the general population. So I mean, just take a look at sort of this list of food items. It probably feels pretty like intuitive if you were to really think about it, but that's what it is, and it's proven out quantitatively. The question though is, let's take a look at some of the items that are on this list, right? The question is, are these things actually trending up? So we have Vidalia onions and coleslaw and navy bean and Bermuda onions and turnovers, and the list sort of goes on and on. I actually want to sort of show what our trend data shows for these things that skew boomer. Are these boomer skewing items things that are actually trending up in the world or in the US, or are they trending downward? So let's take a look at a few of them, right? How about navy bean? This is one of those boomer skewing foods. Well, navy bean is not trending upwards. It's actually trending downwards. Coleslaw is trending downward. It's a boomer skewing food that was on that list, but it's trending in the opposite direction overall. Or something like Bermuda onions, something else that was a boomer skewing ingredient, but trending down on menus over the past 10 years. or a meatloaf sandwich, right? Another boomer skewing food item we saw on that list, also trending downwards over the last 10 years. And if you look at this list of most or top boomer skewing foods, and you then ask the question of, well, is this thing trending upward or downward or flat overall? Here's what it actually looks like. The first thing you will notice is there are not many. In fact, actually, I think there are 0 that are actually up in terms of menu growth. They're all flat or down. And if you see this pattern among boomer skewing foods, intuitively, you would see some sort of an opposite type of a pattern among foods that skew toward other generations. And that's what we actually wanted to explore. So it's an interesting piece of analysis that we did. We looked across almost 4,000 different things you could eat or drink, different flavors, foods, tastes, you name it. And we said, is there a correlation between the things that skew toward one generation and the things that skew toward another generation? And we expressed those results in what we call a correlation coefficient, which you may be familiar with, right? So if something, it's a number between -1 and +1. If it's a positive 1.0, that means that two things are perfectly correlated with each other, that when one thing goes up, the other thing also goes up similarly. If it's a -1.0, that means that they move in completely opposite directions, perfectly predicted. Here you can see some really interesting things, that the tastes of Gen Z and millennials are actually fairly highly correlated, a positive 0.66. That is actually a pretty big number, right? If you did academic research and you found a 0.66 correlation, that would be a very, very strong correlation. So you start to see that there's some similarities between the tastes of Gen Z and millennials. And of course, a Gen Zer is going to have pretty different tastes than a boomer or a Gen Xer. You will see that there is some correlation between a Gen X and a boomer, though. It's a 0.3, a positive 0.3. That is a moderate correlation. It's nowhere near as strong as the 0.66. But you could broadly say that Gen X is sort of similar to boomer in the things they like, but not that similar. Whereas millennials and Gen Z share a greater degree of similarity. And it turns out that boomers are probably the generation that are sort of most different from the rest. There's a host of foods that really skew heavily toward boomer that don't pick up a lot of favor in the other generations. Whereas you see, again, more association between, let's say, Gen Z and millennials. But what we found is that even though you have that high correlation overall, and that you might say that Gen Z and millennials have directionally similar tastes, there is a crazy amount of nuance if you look into the details there, that we should not mistake the taste of Gen Z as being the same as the taste of a millennial. They are quite different. They often move in the same direction, that 0.66, but they are not surrogates for one another. And here's a quick way of seeing that. So let's look at some of the things that skew most toward Gen Z, right? So sort of this is the equivalent to that boomer analysis we just did. So plus 17% skew toward Gen Z for things like smoothie bowls and ramen, or boba, or s'mores, or slushies, or horchata, savory pancakes, and mochi. Those are the top skewing Gen Z foods. How about the top skewing millennial foods? Stuff like blue raspberry, or sushi, or cold brew, or barbecue chicken pizza, or espresso, or Korean barbecue, or fried pickles, or buffalo chicken dip. Not quite the same as we saw on that Gen Z list, right? There is some difference. And the thing that's really quite interesting, though, is even though there is that nuance, we're going to talk about that nuance in a moment, there is one thing that binds this together, which is if you look at the menu growth for these things that skew either millennial or Gen Z, you see the exact opposite of what we saw for boomers. Whereas things that skew boomer tend to be flat or down, things that skew Gen Z or millennial tend to be up or flat on menus. That if you want to see where trends are and where they're headed, a lot of it starts with just understanding what do these younger audiences like, and not just what they like objectively, but what do they like compared to the other generations, which is some of what you're seeing right here. So this got us into a deeper philosophical discussion internally at Datassential about what's actually cool and desirable for each generation. And are there some mental shortcuts that we can make to just understand, hey, what do I do to construct something that's going to be really appealing to one generation or to the next, or that cuts across multiple generations? And one way of thinking about this is we're going to focus on Gen X, Gen Y, millennials, and Gen Z for a moment, and ask, relative to, let's say, something like fashion or your sort of, values and the products that you sort of go after, what are the things that really sort of matter to you? And this is definitely going to be oversimplifying things, but we think it's a good oversimplification that provides a helpful framework as you think about how you construct things for different generations. So if you think about Gen Xers, it was really about premiumness. And if you had to sort of manifest this into, let's say, aspirational fashion or clothing brands that Gen Xers say is really great, it might manifest as something like a Louis Vuitton, for instance. Among millennials, it was not so much about going after things that felt really premium. It's a little bit more about things that feel a little bit more authentic or artisan in a way. And in the world of fashion, that might be something like an Urban Outfitters or some other brands that feel a little bit more authentic, not like just the super premium ones. And among Gen Z, what you see is this sort of movement towards things that are just sort of fun or unique, or that are, utterly not like anything else. And this manifests in a number of ways, right? So not a lot of Gen Zers can probably actually afford something from Supreme, but if you think about the ethos of that brand, everything's sort of limited run. There aren't that many of them in the world. And it becomes something that is quite aspirational for a Gen Zer on a fashion basis. But I wasn't sure if we were fully satisfied with that description of what's cool for a Gen Zer as it relates to fashion. So we had a smart person inside Datassential that provided a much better assessment, and it's this. Anything that is 3 sizes too big that they find at the thrift store, using his Gen Z sister-in-law as a reference point. There's actually quite a lot of truth to this, right? Because it speaks to something that is unique and individual as opposed to something that is utterly mass-produced. And this is one of those sort of core tenets that I think you see in what becomes desirable in Gen Z. And we wanted to see how this might play out with something like food. So if you look at, let's say, those 3 generations, Gen X, Gen Y, Gen Z, think about that. Premium, authentic, fun, and unique. How does that manifest in what's desirable in food? Well, for Gen Xers, that premiumness is what led us down a road starting about 15, 20 years ago, where all of a sudden you started seeing, Angus beef being called out, or sirloin called out, or that it was wood-fired, or something that spoke to a more premium, tier of ingredient, or a more premium preparation method. Those things all became popular in that period of time when Gen Xers really came into all their buying and spending power. For Gen Y, authenticity led to a movement toward chef-driven menus, artisan, handcrafted items, as well as global flavors, perhaps done in an authentic way. That became a next wave of trends. For Gen Z, fun and unique, look at some of those items that we just saw. Big skews toward things that are like boba or mochi or over-the-top Instagrammable food items. It's a different sort of an ethos. And there's a really interesting question to ask about Gen Z, which is, this is, some people call it the trend-averse generation. By the time it becomes a big trend, it just becomes totally uncool to the Z. There's a love for obscurity among this trend-averse generation. So what does that mean for your approach to trends as you engage with them? There used to be that age-old question, right? Is it a fad or is it a trend? You can almost argue that among Z, that by the time a fad becomes a trend, it no longer is an acceptable trend to them. That the timelines are compressed dramatically, and that understanding fads are probably just as important as understanding the longer term trend if you really want to appeal to that group. So here's just a quick thought exercise that I invite all of you to engage in chat if you can. So think about this, right? Premium, authentic, fun, and unique. Let's say you want to create a burger that appeals to all the different generations. What would that burger look like? If you want to take a creative stab at this, use chat and toss out your ideas, but these are the types of questions that I think we should be asking going forward. Because while a lot of this comes down to individual flavors that, let's say, a boomer likes versus a millennial likes, and there's lots of examples of that, we track it. Some of this is about the ethos of what matters to us in food too, and how that can be fundamentally different from one generation to the next. How do you satisfy them all together? So if you have any thoughts for a really amazing burger that delivers on all of these things, have at it. So with that, I wanted to return things back to Carly, who's going to talk to us a little bit about this important concept that we call Fusebiquity. Many of you use our Menu Trends platform, which now features menu data from many countries around the world, in addition to the US and Canada. And one of the core ideas that we believe is important for food innovation, specifically for launching things, let's say in the US, is this notion of Fusebiquity, which is to take a ubiquitous platform that people love and infusing it with, unfamiliar flavors from around the world. So Carly, do you want to maybe talk us through that and what we're seeing in the world of Fusebiquity?
So if we go to the next slide and take a look at flavor again, we just wanted to take a look at some of the top loved and liked platforms and flavor. When we look at this list, these are key platforms on which to innovate. So pizza, burger, pasta, sandwich, these are really loved, frequently consumed formats that people are often more accepting of early stage flavors and dishes when they're presented in these formats. So next we wanted to take a look at our global cuisine map because, as we were talking about earlier, a lot of trends come from early stage global cuisines. And today we wanted to explore that through the theme of Indian cuisine and how some operators have created Fusebiquity items with inspiration to Indian cuisine. So if we go to the next slide, just a quick note, India is the second most populous country after China. It's an incredibly diverse country with a variety of amazing regional cuisines, and we're only scratching the surface of that today and presenting some more Americanized versions. So if we go to the next slide, we've got this butter chicken calzone. This is actually from Supercana International in Chicago. So taking that calzone format and putting butter chicken inside of it is a great example of Fusebiquity with Indian cuisine. If we go to the next slide, here we've got a tikka masala poutine from Bad Mash in Los Angeles. So I'm taking poutine, which is actually a pretty early stage dish in and of itself, and putting chicken tikka masala on top of that in this incredible kind of trend forward loaded fried dish is another great Fusebiquity example.
Yeah, but here's the thing, you're right. I mean, even if I don't know what poutine is, if I just get it described to me as, hey, here's some loaded fries that have some cool Indian flavors on it, that's taken almost all the risk out of ordering that in my mind, because I still love fries. I love loaded fries, let's say. And that's really the heartbeat of Fusebiquity.
Exactly. And then this is a chicken grilled cheese with fries and some wine, but they've swapped out a traditional, white bread carrier and used naan instead. So this is kind of the safest approach to safe experimentation. The filling is the same, the format is the same. You're just swapping out the bread and taking something as simple as a grilled cheese and making it feel more trend forward.
Yeah, so actually it's a good example. So let's say you've gotten, let's say, bored with some of the traditional comfort foods you've had at home. This feels like it's different enough to me that I'm like, oh, I don't know if I would know how to even make that at home, but it also doesn't feel so risky to try, which is just a great place for innovation.
Exactly. This is from Curry on Crust, just outside of Detroit. They're an Indian pizzeria, and I was actually reading about this. There's a lot of them that have been popping up around the U.S., kind of combining, Indian flavors with a pizza format. And this is a paneer pizza. Those chunks that you see are paneer cheese. We've got some peppers. We've got some, I believe, I want to say curry sauce underneath the cheese. And their top two selling pizzas are actually their butter chicken pizza and their aloo gobi pizza, which is potato and cauliflower pizza. So, you know, oh, go ahead, Jack.
No, I was going to say, it's actually interesting on Paneer. If you look at our global menu data, one of the things that is least common in the US, but very common around the rest of the world, is Paneer. Mm-hmm. So there are some gaps to fill, certainly, with it still.
Absolutely.
Yep. Thanks for that, Carly. And wow, we finished just on time. Hey, as a quick reminder, another couple of weeks, we have some brand new content again for you. Please join us then. Thanks for joining us today. And please download Pocket Snap right now if you have not already done so. It is a ton of fun to play with. It may waste a couple hours of your afternoon, but it's also super helpful as a tool for you. And again, if you're using Snap or your company uses Snap already, it costs you literally $0 to go ahead and get it installed and have another way of begin accessing all this great information. Carly, thank you again. Thanks to all the Datassential folks that came and shared their pets this morning today. And thanks again to all of you for spending time with us. If you're hungry, I hope you have a really good lunch lined up for yourself, because I'm starving and I'm going to try to find some. Thanks, everybody.